So I'm truly delighted to be here because when I travel, well, I should say probably about 15 years ago, as a climate scientist, I do a lot of talking about climate change, about why it matters and about what we can do about it. And so when I was doing that, starting about 15 years ago, just a second here. When I started doing that, people started asking a very natural question. People started asking, what should I do? And that's an important question because it means that people, you can go ahead and plug it back in now. It means that people are asking the right question because they understand why it matters. But back then, 15 years ago, I didn't know what to say. So I said the obvious. I said, oh gosh, it's still doing that. Well, I'll let you fix it. I said, we can talk about how we can reduce our personal carbon footprint, right? And so I figured, well, I should probably do that too. So I stepped on the carbon scale, so to speak, and I measured my carbon footprint. And I expected it was going to say something like I live in a place that doesn't have public transportation, or I don't eat enough plants, or I get my electricity from sources that are not renewable. But the number one thing that it said to me was, your carbon emissions come from your flying. So I decided then, 15 years ago, that I was going to transition about 80% of the talks I give to virtual talks. And that was before Zoom. And to most people's credit, they let me do that. And then I decided I would only travel if I could bundle multiple events in one place. So I remember the first trip I did that, I was traveling to Washington, D.C. from where I lived in Texas. And I managed to do 4 events in one trip. And so if you divide the carbon of flying by 4 events, it's a lot less. But then I started to do the math and I realized, no, I really want it to be lower than that. So then I started to try to do 8 events when I traveled. And then I started to do 12 events. And then when people invited me, I started to say, I really need a bundle or else I can't come. So if you're wondering why you've never seen me in Singapore before, that's why. But now that I'm both with the Nature Conservancy as well as I'm so fortunate to have many good colleagues around the world, I was able to put together a bundle of, I think we might be up to 28 events. Not all in one day, though. So I am truly delighted to be here, especially because I don't know when I'm going to be back, because assembling that many events takes a long time. But it's just such a pleasure to see people in person and to visit different places and to hear firsthand how climate is changing, why it matters, and what people are already doing about it. So today, I'm starting with an overview of this important topic. And some of it will be familiar to you. Some of it might be a different way of talking about something you already know. And hopefully, I will have a few new things in here as well. So people often talk about climate change as global warming. But then what happens when you have a cold day or a day that's not so hot? Rather than calling it global warming, I've all of a sudden started to call it global weirding. Because wherever you live, things are getting weirder. So, as you know, I live in Texas, which is a very conservative part of the United States. And part of why I live there is because if you want to be a climate scientist, that's one of the best places to do it. Not because it's the easiest, because it's the hardest. And there's so much potential there, though, because there's so much wind, there's so much solar energy, and there's so many climate impacts. So I was waiting to pick up my son from a class one day, and the man behind me said to me, could I ask you a question? And I said, well, of course, we're just standing here in line. And he said, do you feel like the weather has gotten weirder? And I thought about it, and I thought, when you look at the headlines around the world, we know that our weather dice, wherever we live, it's as if we have a pair of weather dice, and we always have a chance to roll a double six, a storm, a flood, a heat wave, a drought, a wildfire. It does feel as if now when we roll our dice, there's 3 6s, or even 4 6s, or even a 7. So wherever we live, we see that our heat waves are getting longer and stronger. I mean, the Mid-Autumn Festival is tomorrow. We see that wildfires are burning greater area. I'm from Canada, if you can't tell, and last summer, our entire country was on fire from one side to the other, and that is the second biggest country in the world. Our droughts are getting more intense. Our typhoons and cyclones and hurricanes are intensifying faster and stronger, and they're dumping more rain. Atmospheric rivers, like we see coming across the Pacific, are stronger, and our heavy rainfalls are more frequent. So I said to him, this man in line, I said, yes, I do think our weather's getting weirder. And he said, I knew it. I've lived here for 30 years, and I knew that something was different. And so today, when we look around the world, if you have a conversation with anyone and you ask them, have you lived here for a long time? Do you feel things are different? Everyone has a story. And that is a huge difference to 10, 20, or 30 years ago. And when we look at the headlines are full. Who here experienced the record heat wave in April and May this year? Anybody experienced that? A few hands. It decimated crops, it closed schools. Who here has experienced a typhoon in the last 2 or 3 years? A few hands too. I live in the US, like I mentioned, where back in the 1980s, there was $1 billion climate and weather disaster every 4 months. By the 2010s, there was one every 2.8 weeks, and last year there was one every 2 weeks. It's no exaggeration to say that we're conducting an unprecedented experiment with the only home we have. And this is important because too often you'll hear people say, well, is it the planet or people? Is it the environment or the economy? How can people live without this planet? Where does the oxygen you breathe come from? Where does the food we eat come from? Everything that we need, from our food to our water, to the air that we breathe, to the infrastructure, the buildings and roads and systems we use, the nature that surrounds us, the nature our life depends on, it isn't about saving the planet. It is quite literally about saving us, because nature doesn't need us. We need nature. Now, I'm very careful to put an asterisk there, because one time, a few weeks after I began to work for the Nature Conservancy, my book, Saving Us, I literally called my book Saving Us because I figured why not? It really communicates the most important thing I think we need to know. It's about saving us. I was doing a radio interview for my book, and I was talking about how climate change affects us all, but it doesn't affect us equally. People who are most vulnerable, people who already don't have a safe place to live or enough food to eat, or enough water to drink, the people who have done the least to cause the problem are the ones who are most affected. So I was talking about that, and it was a call-in show. And so this lady called in and she said, I can't believe you're talking about humans. You don't care about animals at all. I was like, oh. So I said, well, I did just take this job at the Nature Conservancy, and I do care about animals and plants too. So I'm always sure to add that little asterisk there. To be clear, when I say us, I mean all living things. Because again, we cannot live here without nature. Our life depends on nature. So let's turn to talk about solutions now. We've talked about the problem and how bad it is, but what about solutions? Well, often when we get very worried, and around the world, most people are worried. The majority of people are worried. When we get worried, we want solutions, and often when people are worried, they want to fixate on one solution. Oh, if everybody did this, that would fix it. Or if everybody did that, that would fix it. But when we look into it, we realize that there's no one solution that will fix the whole problem. That's the bad news. But the good news is that there are dozens and even hundreds of solutions that will not only address climate change, they will also address the biodiversity crisis, they will reduce pollution, they will alleviate poverty, they will provide food and water for people. There are solutions that are win-win-wins. But if we have to talk about these solutions in 3 categories, I like to use the metaphor of a swimming pool. This is a swimming pool like I grew up with in our backyard, where it's an above-ground swimming pool and my toes could just touch the ground. That's how I learned how to swim. So if you think of the atmosphere like the swimming pool, and the level of water in the swimming pool is like the level of heat trapping gases in the atmosphere. Before the Industrial Revolution, we had just the right amount of water in our pool that our toes could just touch the ground. We had just the right amount of heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere to keep us the perfect temperature for life, and then we put a hose in the pool. And we've been turning the hose up every year. So that hose is our emissions of heat-trapping gases, and the level of water in the pool has not only been rising, it's been rising faster and faster because we're turning up the hose. So the first thing we have to do, obviously, is what? Turn off the hose. But our pool also has a drain. The drain is a way to take water out of the pool. And the biggest part of that drain, our biggest ally, is nature. Nature has the ability to take up our carbon because carbon is not bad. Carbon is essential to life. It is just out of balance. We have too much carbon in the atmosphere, and we don't have enough carbon often in our soils and our ecosystems where we actually want more carbon. But there's one more thing we need to do, and that is we also have to learn how to swim. So of these three categories, the first category, again, is turning off the hose. Stop putting carbon into the atmosphere. Now, often people jump immediately to clean energy, but before we get to clean energy, there's one more thing that's even more important: efficiency. We are so wasteful with our energy. Over half the energy we produce around the world, and in some countries much more than half, is just wasted. And then we need clean energy to replace fossil fuels. We need better land use and agriculture to turn fields into sinks rather than sources. We need to change our behavior. We don't need to be using or doing all the things we do. And then for the very few last drops in the hose, when we've done everything else we can first, that's where we have the energy-intensive and very expensive solutions, like carbon capture and storage. They will not take care of the hose for us. They are the last few drops. We need them, but they are no magic solution. Then how do we make the drain bigger? Well, often here people always say plant trees, right? And I've certainly planted my share of trees. You know, you can use browsers and search engines that will plant trees for you. But it turns out, and you probably know this, that old-growth forests, like the old-growth coastal rainforest on the coast of British Columbia in Canada, like the forests in Indonesia with their deep carbon-filled peat, old-growth forests have much more carbon than anything we could plant. So protecting ecosystems is first. Restoring ecosystems that have become degraded, coastal wetlands, grasslands, forests, mangroves. Then regenerating, that's where you replant when we don't have them anymore. Then don't forget agriculture. Agriculture has the potential to make that drain bigger. In fact, here's something really interesting. At the Nature Conservancy, we've surveyed all around the world to see what the greatest potential is to take carbon out of the atmosphere with nature-based solutions. And in some countries, it might be forests. In some countries, it might be conservation. In some countries, it might be regeneration, planting. But in Canada, you know what the number one potential for nature-based solutions is in Canada? It's the fourth thing on this list. It's climate-smart agriculture. That has the greatest potential for us because we have so many forests. If we could focus on our agriculture, we could take out up to 11% of our emissions out of the atmosphere. And then, for the last few drops down the drain, the expensive and energy-intensive technological solutions, which we need, but are not enough to make the drain bigger all by themselves. But as I mentioned, the water in our pool is now so high in some places that some people's toes can't touch the ground. So we have to do a third thing. We need to turn off the hose, we need to make the drain bigger, and we need to help people learn how to swim. That is adaptation and resilience. We need to ensure our built environment is ready for the changes that are happening. because everything we have was built for a planet that no longer exists. Our building codes, our standards, our roads, our buildings, all of that was created according to what the conditions were like 30, 50, 80 years ago, not today. We need technology that helps us adapt. For example, just increasing the efficiency of supply chains is a huge way to reduce energy and increase resilience. We can work with nature to help us adapt. And we can work with each other to help us adapt. And so this is a lot of what we're working at for the Nature Conservancy. So if you're familiar with the Nature Conservancy, actually, how many people, have you heard of the Nature Conservancy before? Okay, about half the people in the room. So let me tell you what it is. First of all, it is not the Nature Conservatory. I hear that quite a bit. And second of all, this is very confusing. It is the Nature Conservancy in 80 countries, and it's Nature United in Canada. Even more confusing. But it's the same organization. And it was founded 75 years ago as a traditional conservation organization. But about 20, 25 years ago, long before my time, the leaders realized that it's not enough to try to protect the land and the water on which all life depends. That's the motto of the Nature Conservancy. If we don't address the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis, there will be no nature left to conserve. And so now the organization has 6 very ambitious goals. These are incredibly ambitious goals to address climate, biodiversity, and nature. And so what I want to do is I want to give you 6 examples, one for each goal, to talk about what the Nature Conservancy is doing specifically in Asia Pacific. So the first goal is a climate goal to remove or sequester 3 billion metric tons of CO2 per year, which is the equivalent of 25% of China's emissions today. Now, the goal is not to do this in China or Asia Pacific. The goal is to do this around the world. I'm just showing you roughly how much that is. That's very ambitious for one organization. So I talked about how in Indonesia, the forests are so rich with carbon. So the Nature Conservancy has purchased timber concessions. But recognizing that we need timber and that there have to be sustainable business practices, we're trying to figure out how you can sustainably manage timberland by removing, say, 6 or 7 trees per hectare per year, while still retaining biodiversity and retaining carbon. And if we can figure out how to do it at a profit, we're not going to turn into a business. We're going to tell everybody we know how to do it and hope other people will do it, instead of the unsustainable practices that they're doing today. In PNG, there's some very vulnerable people to climate change living along the coast. But if you have healthy, thriving mangroves along the coast, not only do they help to protect coastal ecosystems, not only do they sequester carbon, not only do they provide firewood and livelihoods for people, but they also protect from storm surge. And so investing in local communities, especially investing in women to help replant and care for the mangroves on their own coastlines that protect their own villages and provide them with a source of income and revenue, is one of the things that we are doing to protect those vulnerable people. Land. We have a goal of conserving 650 million hectares of healthy lands, equivalent to twice the size of India. This also contributes not just towards climate goals, but it contributes also towards the biodiversity goals as well. So just a few months ago, with the government of Mongolia, we helped to secure Eternal Mongolia, which is 30% of the entire country of Mongolia being protected. Unique grasslands and ecosystems which do store carbon, but which also protect freshwater resources as well. And, of course, protect land and habitat, and provide for people's living. Freshwater. Conserve 1 million kilometers of river and 30 million hectares of lakes and wetlands. I don't know about you, but my eyes sort of tend to glaze over after too many millions. So again, it's enough to wrap around the world 25 times. How are we doing that? In many areas, we have large urban cities. This is true in India. This is true in Africa. This is true here in Asia. Large urban centers are growing rapidly and they need water. How are they going to get the water? We are trying to demonstrate and show that restoring wetlands and investing in watersheds through nature-based solutions is going to be not only more sustainable, but also more effective to supplying fresh water, the fresh water that people need, as well as ensuring the ecosystems have the fresh water they need. And then oceans. We want to help conserve an area 4 times the size of the South China Sea. How are we doing that? Well, in Hong Kong, we're doing it at a very small scale, working with the airport to restore oysters to their seawall, working along the undeveloped coastline to continue to invest in coastline restoration with mangroves, with habitat, and with sustainable oyster fishing with local fisher people. But at scale, we're doing it even larger, for example, in Barbados. So countries like Barbados have very large national debt, typically at a high interest rate. And what the Nature Conservancy does is to act as a broker to find a financial organization or institution who is willing to refinance the debt for a lower interest rate if the country agrees to use the money it saved for climate and biodiversity. So in the case of Barbados, using the money they saved, they set aside 30% of their marine area. 30% was set aside as a marine protected area, and the Nature Conservancy also acts as a monitor, an evaluator to ensure this is still being conducted according to the best conservation practices. We're doing this with Belize, we did it with Seychelles, and these deals are happening around the world. We've done, I think, 5 or 6 successful deals. We need 2,000 of them. So it isn't about what we can do ourselves, it's about showing what works and then being ambassadors to everyone else to say, hey, it works, can you do it too? And then our last goal is to support 45 million local stewards who depend on the land, water, and ocean. So in the Solomon Islands, we're educating turtle rangers. And it's the women in the community who are doing this. So we're addressing issues of gender equity and conservation and biodiversity. You probably know there's 7 species of sea turtles. Most of them are endangered, critically endangered, and the ones that aren't are about to be. They travel the world, yet they return to the same places to nest. And they also provide all kinds of other ecosystem benefits as well. So how are we doing? How are we doing globally with all of these actions? Well, according to the Climate Action Thermometer, thanks to all the policies that have been put in place since the Paris Agreement in 2015, when at that time we were heading for a world that was 4 to 5 degrees C warmer by 2100. Let that sink in. 15 years ago, we were headed to 4 to 5 degrees C by 2100, and now we're headed to 2.7, 2.2 to 3.4 plus or minus. So what does this mean? It means we've made progress, that's the good news, but not enough, that's the bad news. And if you're interested, this is Singapore's score. The bad news is Singapore is rated as highly insufficient. And you're wondering, what's the good news? The good news is you have an opportunity to make a huge difference. Remember I said I lived in Texas? You live in Singapore. And that means that you have the chance to move the needle much more than someone who lives in Costa Rica, which is rated as almost sufficient, if you're wondering. Why is Costa Rica rated as almost sufficient? Because people who live there use their voice to advocate for change. Costa Rica or other countries like Bhutan or countries like Scotland, they're not particularly wealthy countries. They're fine, but they're not super rich. They're not particularly technologically advanced. They're fine, but they're not world leaders. But what they had was people who wanted to make a difference. So that is a challenge. And we know that we have the climate COP coming up, where they will be discussing issues of finance and loss and damage and support for the countries who are bearing the brunt of the impacts. We also know that we have the biodiversity COP coming up, right? This one's in Colombia. And this is the first COP since the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework was signed. The 30 by 30 by 30 goal. So my last question is this: how do we make this go faster, right? Because we are headed in the right direction, but we're not headed in the right direction fast enough. So how do we make this go faster? And don't forget, if you have questions, to start putting them in and upvoting the questions, because we'll be getting to those in just a few minutes. So the tipping points that I, as a physical climate scientist, are paying the most attention to today are not the physical tipping points. Yes, I follow the research about the circulation in the Atlantic. I follow the research about the ice sheets and the Amazon. But what I am most interested in is the research on the social tipping points, on what it would take for us to go faster. And there was a very interesting analysis 4 years ago now that actually listed what the strongest social tipping points are for speeding this up. Building carbon neutral cities. Could that be done here? Revealing the moral implications of fossil fuels. Do you know every major world religion is not only represented here in Singapore, but has as part of its core doctrine caring for, protecting nature, being a good steward, and caring for those less fortunate than us? What about strengthening climate education and engagement? I was able to have breakfast a few weeks ago with the woman who wrote the mandatory climate curriculum for the schools of New Jersey. Isn't that something that we could do here too? And disclosure, obviously, too. So here's all the people who are worried about climate change. As you can see, almost everyone, the gray areas were not surveyed, almost everyone is worried, other than in countries where you don't know if you're actually going to wake up the next morning. But here are the countries where people even have conversations about it once a week. And you know what stands out to me with this map? I can't prove it, but I think you can see the influence of a single individual on this map who is not wealthy, she is not powerful, she's not even very old, but she has a really good voice. And I think that you could see the influence of Greta Thunberg on this map. And if she can do it, can't we? So that's why I'm convinced that the first thing we can all do is have conversations, because it changes not only how we see ourselves and what people around us think, but it changes what we view as acceptable and not acceptable. It changes our sense of, if I do something, if we do something, will it make a difference? That's efficacy. And it changes our ability and willingness to act. Because if you don't talk about it, why would you care? And if you don't care, why would you do anything about it? So the image that I keep in my head is this. Climate action is not a giant boulder with only a few people's hands on it. Climate action is a giant boulder that is rolling down the hill in the right direction with 1 million people's hands on it. And each of us has the ability to speed that up, because what's at stake is a better future. And isn't that something that every single one of us wants? Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Katharine. We will now move on to the Q&A segment. Mm-hmm. So just give us a while where we flash the pigeonhole.
Yes. I love this because I always use a tool that collects questions and lets people upvote them. And this is the first time that I've actually had somebody already prepared to do that. So thank you.
All right. Okay, so we have a first question that has 2 votes. So I'll just read it out briefly. Please share your thoughts on avoided emissions, or the proverbial scope 4 in relation to the Article 6 versus...
Ooh. Oh, good. Keep voting. This is good. Okay, so As I mentioned, I'm a physical climate scientist. And so what matters is the total amount of carbon, total amount of carbon in the atmosphere. That is what climate responds to. So that's what the science says. The science says every action matters, every choice matters, but then our value system comes into play. Our economic systems come into play. We design policies and frameworks and ways to count and measure and motivate people to act. And when it comes to how people interact with information and how people affect change, there is no black and white. We need to not only try as many ways as we can, but we have to monitor and evaluate them to make sure they're actually accomplishing what they need to. And I know that's a bit more general answer than this question was specific to, but I think that this answer applies to both this question and to policies in general. We're trying to do something we've never done before. We have never taken a global economy with 8 billion people on the planet that was built on the assumption that the world is flat and infinite. Just think about it. That's what our economy assumes, that there's always more input and that you can always put the output over there where it doesn't bother you. We're trying to transition that to a round planet. And so to that end, we have to try and monitor and evaluate, and if that doesn't work, try something else, every policy mechanism we can. And I want to be very clear that what's happening with the UN FCCC is only this much of what needs to happen with cities, with countries, with provinces, with states, with companies, with NGOs, with organizations, with schools. We can't do it alone, but we can do it together, and every single one of us has a role to play. Every organization at every level. All right.
So next question. The ambitious initiative of the Nature Conservancy are amazing. Are there any intentions for them to be registered as carbon offset projects as part of the carbon markets?
Mm-hmm. So this is a great question because when I travel, I do offset the travel once I've reduced what I can and I bundle what I can, but I don't buy my offsets from the Nature Conservancy because they don't offer them. But what we are trying to do is work with organizations to figure out how to effectively use carbon as a way to motivate and encourage financial flows. Because often the parts of the world that have the most carbon and the most biodiversity are the ones who are suffering the greatest impacts of climate change and who do not have the economic resources to manage their own lands the way they want to if they had the ability to do so. So this is certainly something that we're very involved and engaged in. We're working very hard to try to help with reevaluating the voluntary carbon market, which has been sullied by the massive greenwashing and bad actors over the last few years. But I personally think that if this is a tool that could be used to invest in low-income communities that are being harmed by climate change to enable them to protect and invest in their own resources, if this is a financial mechanism that, if done well, could help them do it, then I think we need to make that happen. All right.
So our next question,
mm-hmm.
why did Singapore do so?
Oh!
Could you share more about how it was measured and how to improve?
That's a very good question. So if you go to, let's see, I'll just pull this up so I can, it comes from the Climate Action Tracker. So if you Google Climate Action Tracker, they have one of these for every country. And what they do is they go through in detail the policies and the projections. And my personal bias, I think that often they tend to be a little bit conservative. So for example, when I've looked at their Canada one, this analysis tends to be a little bit, I would rank Canada slightly better because there's a few more things going on. They're trying to do every country in the world, right? So if you feel like they missed something about Singapore, I would suggest you write them and say, hey, did you know that they were also doing this, or did you include that? But if you go to the Climate Action Tracker, they will have more information on how they make this evaluation.
Okay, in light of time, we will do one last question.
Okay.
So what's your view on biodiversity credits?
Okay, so with carbon credits, carbon is a molecule that can be measured, right? Everybody knows what carbon is. Biodiversity is something that we know it if we see it, but it is very difficult to measure. Originally, scientists proposed, well, how about just the number of species? Well, there's some really essential ecosystems that might not have a great number of species, but they have a smaller number of really important species. So is that lower biodiversity? So the challenge is that it's not as cut and dried to measure as it is with carbon. And we have enough problems trying to measure carbon effectively because how long does it stay in the soil? How long does it stay in the trees? What is the future wildfire risk that we have to factor in when we're trying to make these calculations for the future? So it's really difficult to put a number on it, but does that mean it isn't important? No, in fact, it might mean it's even more important. Because again, our very lives depend on nature. So I know there's a lot of very thoughtful people, and you'll probably hear from some of those over the coming year and more, very many thoughtful people who are considering what does nature positive look like in today's economy? How can we change how we think about economic value to incorporate investment in nature? What does biodiversity look like, and how can we not... It isn't as exchangeable or fungible as carbon. Like one molecule of carbon here is one molecule of carbon there. There is a difference between whether you dig it up from underground where it's been there for millions of years or you take it from a tree where it just got pulled out of the atmosphere a few decades ago. But with biodiversity, imagine if you rip down a forest here and you conserve an equal area of forest here and you say, oh, that's the equivalent biodiversity credit. It's not. So we're working on that, and we're trying to consider, we actually have a project in Australia right now, in the Asia-Pacific region, where we're trying to ensure that where there's any development, that equivalent biodiversity in the equivalent ecosystem is protected. And it's not easy to do, but I think just because it isn't easy doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. In fact, like I said, I think it's even more important because the bottom line, again, is nature doesn't need us. We need it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all for your questions, and thank you, Prof. Katharine, for the insightful sharing. Okay, we all know how busy Prof. Katharine is. 28 events is quite a bit. So we shall not hold her back, and let us put our hands together to thank her once again for being here. All right, so we will now move on to the next segment of today's program. So we have two very exciting panels coming up. The first panel will discuss and answer questions revolving Article 6, and the second panel will dive into blue carbon project development in Asia Pacific. Each panel boasts a lineup of experienced and knowledgeable panelists. So I will now invite our panelists for the Article 6 panel to take their seats on the stage, as well as Ms. Melissa Loh, who will be moderating the panel on Article 6 Explainer. Panelists and Mel, please.
All right. Thanks, Cheryl. And we've got the mics for you coming up. Okay. All right. Thanks, Cheryl. And welcome, everybody. My name is Melissa, and I'm a research fellow at the NUS Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions. Thanks so much for being here with us on a Monday afternoon. And of course, thank you so much to our panelists for agreeing to speak as well. So I have the pleasure today of being the moderator for this first panel on Article 6. And today, of course, we're here to discuss Article 6, but beyond that, we know that, as Prof. Katharine earlier mentioned, nature-based solutions is not only here to serve the carbon markets, right? So we're going to think also about climate adaptation, resilience, and so we have put together this panel to hopefully deep dive into some of these issues this afternoon. One of the impetus for putting together this panel, and I'll ask my colleague Marcus to go to the next slide. I don't know how many of you have actually seen this explainer. I found it very helpful. The TNC, the Nature Conservancy, puts out an explainer. It's actually several explainers on many different things. But their explainer on Article 6 has actually just been updated this year to incorporate the COP28 outcomes. And so if any of you are interested to follow Article 6, please do download a copy of the explainer online. And again, I found it extremely useful in some of the lectures that we give at NUS and for executive courses as well. So I'll just leave this up so that if any of you have questions about it, you can refer to the screen. All right. Right, before we get into panel, let me first maybe just give you an overview of how we're going to organize this panel. I will first allow our speakers, or invite our speakers, our panelists, to give a short introduction about themselves. I've allocated 5 minutes for each of them because they'll be doing self-introductions. All right, and within the self-introductions, they'll also share with you what they actually do and any remarks that they would like to share as well with everybody. And then we'll see the time, we'll look at the time, but I have prepared some questions, as all good moderators do. But we'll see. If there are a lot of questions that come up on the pigeonhole, I might go straight to the pigeonhole questions. Okay, so perhaps let's begin. May I first invite Mr. Mok Yi-Chun, who is the Senior Manager of Global Partnerships at the National Climate Change Secretariat, which is within the Prime Minister's office, to give his opening remarks. Yeah, Yi-Chun, please. Use one of the mics there.
Thank you, Mel. Is this working? Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I hope we turn your Monday blues into more blue carbon outcomes. But jokes aside, I'm from the National Climate Change Secretariat. NCCS, as Mel mentioned, is a unit within the Prime Minister's office. We help to coordinate our country's medium to long-term climate policies, including supporting the work of our Ambassador for Climate Action, Ravi Minute. As the only Singapore government representative here, I feel like I also need to just mention a little bit about the Climate Action Tracker. They do rate just 40 countries, and while we are quite happy to see that our rating has improved from critically insufficient to highly insufficient, we are in quite a esteemed company if you look on the list of countries, but I think we find that the methodology doesn't really reflect well the circumstances of small, densely populated, alternative energy disadvantaged countries. We don't have the same decarbonization options as a lot of our larger neighbors. We can't do massive hydropower installations, for example. And a lot of our climate work actually happens through international partnerships, carbon markets being one of them. So without detouring too long, I wanted to just maybe speak briefly about 3 things in these opening remarks, and happy to take questions as well. Please ask me very difficult questions. I'm a bit jet lagged, but if I yawn, it's just because of that. And 3 things, really. Why carbon markets? Why nature-based solutions, and what Singapore is doing to try to help drive implementation of nature-based solutions, particularly in our region. We see climate change in part as a resource allocation problem. For a lot of the measures that we need to implement, which Professor Hayhoe has very well mapped out for us as well, all of these require finance. But the problem is that in the absence of market signals and incentives, these finance flows aren't guaranteed. And so the role of carbon markets really is as an essential tool to channel finance, particularly private capital, to the countries and projects that need them most. Our friends at AIDA have helpfully estimated that carbon trading can help halve the cost of NDC achievement by 2030 to meet countries' climate targets. And Bloomberg has also estimated that carbon markets were worth about $2 billion annually at present, could be worth $1.1 trillion annually by 2050. So that's a significant amount of capital mobilization that we need. If not, we won't be able to keep 1.5 degrees within reach or to achieve net zero. And I think really when we think about the finance flows, it's about making sure that countries don't have to choose between sustainability or development. And that's really why we believe that carbon markets are so important. And we have voluntary carbon market that exists today, but also Article 6, which we can go into more details on, but it's very dense. But why nature-based solutions? And I think for us, when we look at the region, Southeast Asia is one of the world's most climate vulnerable regions. And that's also because of the long coastlines in the region and low-lying lands that we have. And overall, the impacts of climate change could cost Southeast Asia up to 11% of its GDP by 2100, just for adaptation efforts. nature-based solutions aren't just a way to reduce or remove emissions, but they also bring about very significant adaptation buffers and also sustainable development co-benefits, for example, in biodiversity and in conservation as well. Blue carbon, which the next panel will talk about in a lot more detail, is really the salient one for Southeast Asia, because we are home to the world's largest stock of blue carbon at 4.8 billion megagrams of carbon, or MGC. To put that into context, the region in the world with the next highest blue carbon stock, the Gulf of Mexico, has only 0.5 billion MGC. So Southeast Asia has 9 to 10 times more blue carbon stock. But despite the importance of blue carbon, which sequesters between 2 to 5 times more carbon than terrestrial ecosystems, there's still a significant amount of degradation and removal of blue carbon ecosystems at about 340,000 to 980,000 hectares annually. And this could release an additional 500 million tons of carbon into the atmosphere. So nature-based projects that both conserve and restore nature ecosystems, including blue carbon, are critical for our region as well. What Singapore is trying to do to help drive the flows of finance in carbon markets, a few levels. The first, I think, is how do we make sure that our approaches are based on the best available science? And so the Singapore government works with CNCS to run a program called Carbon Integrity SG, which is developing estimates on blue carbon baselines and blue carbon stocks and nature-based stocks in the region, as well as developing methodologies as well that are tailored to the Southeast Asia region. But with the best available science, we also need implementing partners. And so the Economic Development Board is providing a range of support to headquarter different organizations working on NBS in Southeast Asia. For example, we supported the launch of the TNC Singapore office. Hello, good to see you guys. And we also work to help set up other organizations as well in Singapore, like the International Blue Carbon Institute, which I'm sure Lauren will speak about more in detail later as well. Lastly, it's really about how we galvanize partnerships in the region to enable carbon trading. And so Singapore today is in talks with more than 20 countries to do Article 6 collaboration. And we also have an MOU just signed recently, actually, with Indonesia on blue carbon empowerment for local communities. And so we're working with the Indonesian government to facilitate NGOs participation, starting with a pilot in Setokop Island in Batam. So overall, just to say that we believe carbon markets are an important enabler that will channel investment to the countries and projects that need them most. And the world can't do without it. And we're here to play our part to help enable that ecosystem. And happy to go into the weeds and more details on this in a bit. Yeah. Thanks. Back to you, Mel.
Great. Thank you so much, Yi-Chun. That was a great opening set of remarks. Now let's turn to Dr. Theresa Wong. She's the head of science at the IPCC Working Group 2 Technical Support Unit in Singapore. Theresa, please.
Thanks very much. I had to combine an introduction with some substantive remarks, but it's nice to be back. I did my undergrad at NUS, a long time ago, so 1 gazillion years ago. So nice to be back here. I actually also just got back to Singapore. I've taken up this position at the IPCC Technical Support Unit only a couple of months back, working, of course, with Winston Chow, also of NUS fame. In the past, we went to uni together. So what we do as a technical support unit is we make sure that the co-chairs, him and the other co-chair who is also looking after Working Group 2, have the sort of technical capacity, resources, and coordination time that they need to make sure that all the milestones, we reach the milestones of the 7th assessment cycle. So we're very proud to have this be hosted in Singapore. And I'm very happy to come back for this reason. So I think when Mel asked me to talk about what I know best in a panel called Article 6, I was like, I don't know anything about Article 6. I'm more of an adaptation specialist, and for the last 10 years, I've worked in different organizations in the United Nations, starting from the UN Development Program, and then the last 7 years in the Food and Agricultural Organization, actually working outside of the region. I spent the last almost 5 years working out of Cairo in the Middle East. So a lot of what I know is about adaptation. But I'm also a climate change person who is keeping tabs on what is going on in terms of negotiations and what countries are looking out for. So I guess what I'm here to say, I feel like I'm the adaptation sandwich filling in the mitigation bread, is that when I've also worked as an adaptation person, a specialist, but a climate change specialist. Nature-based solutions have always been there as important solutions. I mean, since I'm also wearing the IPCC hat, we can safely say that NBS features very prominently in the sixth assessment report. There's a cross-chapter box on it. There's pages and pages on listing of different kinds of NBS strategies, some challenges. So please look at the sixth assessment report. We also have very high confidence from the report that I think some of these that adaptation solutions that have co-benefits for mitigation, adaptation, and sustainable development goals have very high confidence of working. So these days, we don't really need to argue for adaptation anymore, but we do need to argue a little bit more for strategies that combine So that also try to meet adaptation goals and sustainable development goals. Mel knows quite well because she follows the negotiations, and when you are in a UNFCCC negotiation setting, the countries are differentiated by different levels of development, where they stand in terms of a capacity to implement very sort of high concept mitigation programs, carbon market mechanisms, to other countries which are still struggling to battle actually increasing levels of food insecurity around the world. We know that the last 5 to 10 years have been especially challenging for many countries on the development front. This is all the sorts of conflicts and the different crises relating to Ukraine, and in the Middle East region. I have seen in the last 5 years Sudan, erupt, and then Gaza, affecting just untold amounts of sort of damage, but also supply chains. So I think NBS solutions are actually really interesting because they occupy the space of adaptation, mitigation, co-benefits, but they also respond to what the sixth assessment report has been saying, that our climate change impacts are moving into the sort of complex and cascading realm of impacts. And as a social scientist, I don't need anyone to tell me that anytime you do something in the field, it has complex and cascading impacts. Because when you affect people, when you are trying to implement something that affects a farmer's life and the way households, conduct their business, everything reverberates, right? So I think when it comes to Article 6 carbon markets and nature-based solutions, I think we are pushing into an era where a lot of these co-benefits need to be taken into consideration. I think this leads to more sustainable outcomes. I'm just trying to look at my notes now after talking off the cuff for a long time. A lot of these challenges, but also relate to how adaptation is also expected to become less and less effective as we enter into scenarios where our emissions are increasing, and we see different emission scenarios. And this is what we're trying to cut in the end, right? Why we're going into carbon markets is we're trying to reduce emissions, because at higher levels of emissions, we're seeing adaptation become less and less effective. We have to work harder. Our trees have to work harder. Our systems are starting to fail on certain fronts. And this is what Dr. Hayhoe talked about, maybe some of these tipping points, which are also physical, but then also go into social tipping points. So I think as by way of introduction, maybe that's where I will stop.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. And of course, last but not least, we have Mr. Bjorn Fonden. He's the International Policy Advisor with the IETA Singapore, and I'll invite him to give his opening remarks. Bjorn, please.
Thank you very much. And thank you to you for putting together the panel, and of course also to a very distinguished audience. So I think we want to keep a very dynamic conversation. There are many here with much more experience than all of us together on the panel. So I think I'm here to represent the private sector. IETA is known as the International Emissions Trading Association. We have over 350 member companies all over the world. Some represent the largest emitters in the world, also some of the largest financial institutions, product developers, standards, verifiers, basically anyone with interest in carbon markets. And our aim is really to make net zero possible. Why? because we know that we are falling dangerously short of meeting our climate targets. We heard from Professor Hayhoe about the challenges we are facing. I just came back from Hanoi myself last week, where, of course, Typhoon Yagi has created disastrous impacts all over the country. I think more than 250 dead confirmed and thousands injured, and of course extreme impacts on the economy. And that really highlights both the importance of increasing our mitigation speed, scale, and ambition, as well as, of course, on building resilience and adaptation. And even though our sole focus as an association is on emissions trading and carbon markets, I want to highlight that that's just one tool to financing additional mitigation efforts and finance towards adaptation and resilience. So Yi-Yun stole my talking points about increasing ambition through Article 6 and the research we made with the University of Maryland. But basically, it shows us that by leveraging, and Professor Hayhoe highlighted that, of course, the entire fundamental of why carbon markets work is because a particle of GHG emissions in one country counts just the same in the atmosphere as a particle in another country, or emitted by another company. Now, what this allows us to do is to utilize the differences in marginal abatement costs. It's not an academic lecture, but I think it's quite important to highlight that, for example, in a country like Singapore, without discussing the ambition in the NDC, simply saying that Singapore, of course, has different opportunities to mitigate at different costs as compared to other countries. And the same applies for companies. If you are a company that, for example, produces cement, the cost of reducing emissions within the cement industry or steel industry right now is much higher than reducing emissions, for example, in other industries where you can use energy efficiency gains. So shouldn't we then use that money the most wise ways to scale up again the speed and ambition in which we reduce emissions? So I think that's kind of the reason why I'm here, why I think this is so important, and why we also have Article 6 of the Paris Agreement enshrined as a principle. But that leads us to two important assumptions. Number one, of course, is the quality of the credit, of the underlying unit that we are trading, i.e. the supply. And number two is the quality of the demand. And maybe we can go into this a bit more detail. I'm not a technical researcher, but basically if you look at the supply side, I think it comes down to three key things. One is the methodology in which we are assessing and generating a carbon credit, i.e. an emission reduction or a removal coming from a certain type of project or activity. Number two is the project implementation that happens on the ground. And number three is the MRV and the validation that needs to come from preferably an independent, a third-party validator to make sure that that credit that is generated represent 1 ton. And this is where a lot of the current, let's say, confusion or challenges in the market actually deals with. And there are many underlying principles. I think we won't have time to go into each of them around additionality, permanence, leakage. Maybe we can discuss a bit. But the second point is on the demand side. So the demand side is, in a carbon market, artificial. It's a demand, for example, food is not an artificial demand. I need as much food as my body needs. Maybe I need less someday and more some other day. Most of the time I need a lot. But for carbon markets, the demand is essentially coming either from countries committing to net zero voluntarily, because the Paris Agreement is a bottom-up approach, so countries set their own NDCs, or it's coming from companies that also, in most cases, set targets voluntarily to meet net zero commitments by a certain time frame. So this demand right now, as we saw, is ratcheting up to 2.7 degrees, meaning the demand is not the real demand that we need to see to meet our climate targets. And then, of course, it's quite easy to, let's say, criticize the markets for not delivering the ambition necessary, because the demand is not in line with what we need to achieve. And then you come to the question, why is the demand not in line with our Paris Agreement targets? Well, because of stakeholder pressures. So I think this is coming back to the point that Professor Hayhoe was making, that basically for a company to reduce their own emissions or to use carbon markets to reduce their emissions, there must be pressures from their stakeholders, whether it's investors, employees, consumers, to increase their ambition. And the same for countries. They need pressure from their stakeholders, whether it's the voters, whether it's internally within the system, whether it's international financiers. And that, in the end, I think, creates the whole kind of carbon market landscape and ecosystem. So happy to talk about the nuances and details of that. Thank you.
Thanks, Bjorn. That was really fascinating. Yeah, maybe if we have time, we can pick up on that, because as we all know, the window for the next NDCs for 2035 is opening in it's opening next year, right? So 2035 NDCs are due next year. And I think looking at Article 6 and how countries want to engage in Article 6, we'll probably see a very interesting set of NDCs because of the whole additionality issue. So it's slightly worrying, but we'll see what happens next year. Okay, so my colleague Marcus has very kindly flashed up the QR code for this panel's Q&A. So, but before that, so as you're thinking about your questions based off of the opening remarks of our panelists, please key them in and upvote them. So I'll take a look in a bit, but I did want to, because all of you came for an Article 6 panel, so I did want to ask Yi-Jun, who is a climate negotiator in Article 6, to give us maybe a very quick state of play. I know it's really difficult, really difficult, because it takes a long time to really get into Article 6, but state of play. So I know the biggest item obviously is 6.4, right? This year, Article 6.4, which is the one in the middle just now that you saw the explainer. And for those of you who have been following Article 6 and Singapore's international carbon credit framework, as well as its eligibility criteria, perhaps, Yi-Jun, you can speak also to the safeguards that Singapore has put in place for nature-based projects, because I think some people would have noticed that we currently don't include HFLD and forestry projects in our eligibility. So perhaps useful for this audience to hear from you on behalf of the Singapore government as to what are the safeguards that we've put in place. Thanks, Yi-Jun.
I'll try to keep this very brief. It's a bit hard, as you mentioned. But two things, I suppose. One is, you mentioned not being familiar with Article 6. I work in Article 6, and even I don't feel like I'm familiar with it. The second is, the first time I ever did Article 6, I walked into the room and someone said something to the effect of, according to paragraph 18G, Annex 2, Decision 2, CMA free, and I stood there just thinking, I understand English, but none of this is making sense to me. So I'll try to break this down as much as I can. Article 6 had two milestone agreements at COP26 and COP27. Both of which were co-facilitated by Minister Grace Fu. COP26 prepared what we call the Article 6 rulebook, which is the overarching package of decisions around Article 6 itself, and COP27 delivered further guidance. And the consensus view among a lot of the parties, including Singapore, is that actually Article 6 is already operational. Under Article 6.2, which is bilateral approaches, usually country to country, Switzerland and Thailand have already completed the first transaction of carbon credits. And under Article 6.4, which is almost like a centralized marketplace at the UN, FCCC, actually with the transition of previous CDM projects from the Clean Development Mechanism into Article 6.4, 6.4 will be operational this year. So the view is that there is quite a lot of guidance already to go off, and without further guidance, Article 6 approaches will continue. But there needs to be further guidance in the room to reassure markets. And I think there are three tranches of issues that we're really looking at, in addition to the 6.4, which is really about operationalizing the marketplace. The first is infrastructure, or what we call registries. There are ongoing debates about what kind of functionalities you need your international registry to have in 6.2, what kind of registry interoperability you need between the 6.2 and 6.4 registries. If it's not making sense to you, it usually doesn't make sense to me as well. But the infrastructure issue and how that looks like is one of the buckets. The next bucket is what we call transparency, which is, for example, how should countries even report information in Article 6? We call this the agreed electronic format. It's a series of tables. But without this kind of a template and format, countries don't know how to submit their information. So there's outstanding guidance required on the transparency front as well. The last bucket of issues is what we call authorization. When you authorize a carbon credit, what needs to go into your authorization statement? What happens if you need to change your authorization? Can you change an authorization status after first transfer or issuance of the credit? So there are a number of buckets of issues where, without further guidance, Article 6 approaches will continue, but further guidance is needed to assuage the market and convince stakeholders that this can work. Just very briefly on safeguards, Singapore is quite sector and project type agnostic. We're willing to accept any project type that meets our environmental integrity criteria, which is a set of 7 principles that we've laid out. But everything for us has to come down to the best available science and whether the carbon credit truly represents an emissions reduction or removal. So 2 points that I would raise just on nature. First is that when it comes to forestry, we only consider jurisdictional and nested RIT plus projects. And that is when you think about the entire area of the forest. Just simplifying this. If I deforest in one part but I credit in another, are we really reducing emissions? Maybe not. So a jurisdictional approach is where we take the entire jurisdiction of the forest and really consider the emissions reductions from there. The second one is, of course, HFLD, which Mel briefly mentioned, which is high forestry, low deforestation. In countries where historically there's been low deforestation, how do I prove that I'm actually reducing emissions if the baseline is so high? And there are some approaches that are being considered that create an artificial sort of benchmark or crediting factor to kind of shift the baseline. We continue to look at this. I think we are not closing the door, but we want to just make sure that any methodology we use is rooted in the best available science to represent real emissions reductions or removals. So sorry, I know that was quite a bit of information there, but happy to take more questions later during the networking if helpful. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. I hope that was... I know if it's not easily understood, at least you have taken down some key terminologies and you can ask Google. I often do that as well. But if you didn't get it, actually, to be very frank, Article 6 is extremely complex, right? So don't worry. You have plenty of time to go and read up. And obviously, that's what the TNC Article 6 explainer is for as well. I saw many of you taking out your phones just now, so that indicates to me that it was the first time that you've heard about the explainer. So you're in the right place, right, to learn about Article 6. And there's ongoing negotiations that will take place at COP29 very soon, happening in Baku, Azerbaijan. There'll be opportunities to participate virtually, I'm sure, and to keep track of what's happening there. I did want to pivot back to the pool, right? The global warming pool, whatever that Prof. Katharine was talking about, and the need to help people to swim, learn how to swim, right? Which is on climate adaptation and resilience. So I wanted to ask Theresa a question about maybe if you can give some examples of how nature-based projects that you've come across, have really helped people, enhance their resilience and adaptation, and the co-benefits. If we can deep dive a little bit into the co-benefits that you talked about earlier.
Thanks very much. Actually, just listening to each, and adaptation is so much more hard to measure. Just now, it was the question posed in the slide about carbon credit versus how do you, account for biodiversity. And in the realm of vulnerability, impacts, and adaptation, we're constantly looking at, the co-benefit spread is much higher. We have to address environment, ecology, but also livelihoods, and make them sustainable. And this is sort of the pivot of climate resilience. The examples that I've encountered in the last few years have been in the Middle East, but this is also maybe a way to illustrate to you that adaptation is happening whether we are ready for it or not, whether we're ready to monitor it, whether we're ready to assess it, whether we know what targets we should be looking for on a global scale. It's happening. The demand is there, and this is also a kind of a blueprint for all of us. Maybe CNCS working on to drive some of this evidence base for nature-based solutions is super important because the 6 assessment report, for example, tells us there's not enough empirical evidence on nature-based solutions. We know it's working in certain conditions. But do we know the long-term aspects of it? Do we know what are the other conditions that we need to scale this up in order for this adaptation benefits to reach a higher number of people? So the example that I prepared for this after racking my brains was in Yemen. We have in FAO where I used to work, there was this large number of country officers. So they worked very closely with the government in Yemen. It was the Environment Protection Authority to restore agricultural terraces, to restore wells, to sort of the irrigation infrastructure, and also to employ with agroecological approaches. So if you do research on what counts as nature-based solutions, if you see in the agricultural sector, there's use of organic fertilizer, regenerative agriculture, there are some really interesting terms like agro-silvo-pastoralism, combining people who do rangeland management with existing forests and agriculture. So there's integrated approaches, I think, are the heart of a lot of NBS that is implemented all over the world, because we can't really do anything without livelihoods. I mean, I think the spirit of TNC having moved from being a conservation organization to one that also cares about people and livelihoods, and all the examples that were shown in the slides are the essence of what a lot of adaptation projects are in NBS. And I think I would just one of the side projects in that Yemen project that I'm sort of alluding to is also the planting of cedar forests. So this is also a consideration of a kind of forestry that responds to a sort of a culturally important product that is also a high value product. So this is also to build some kind of a value chain, value chain sustainability within the agricultural sector in Yemen. That was what I was dealing with. I was doing a lot of agriculture stuff. So I think because all these considerations have to be there, adaptation planning is a very, very difficult process. And I'll just come back because we're talking about assessing so clear metrics in the mitigation side. But in adaptation, we know that the global goal on adaptation, which is one of the UNFCCC work streams, alongside with the global stocktake, is trying to set targets for adaptation, is to basically give everybody who's implementing this scrambling to provide climate resilience work on the ground a way to monitor this so that we know what we're being successful at and whether we're successful. Because one of the biggest things, and maybe this is where I'll end, concerns with people doing adaptation projects is whether it is going well, whether are there unintended consequences of this, is there maladaptation, right? So in AR6, and that's the sobering sort of call in the sixth assessment report, it also does say that nature-based solutions, mitigation type solutions, which looked at maybe forest restoration or seeing forests as sort of units for carbon market mechanisms, there's also a large risk. If we don't do these properly, if we don't design these properly, these will have unintended impacts on the people who live around there, to depend on the forests, and who are also important stakeholders. So I think this is well, and this is a way that our sort of universe needs to consider these two sides of things. Yeah.
Thanks, Teresa. That's very important insight on adaptation, and I appreciate you trying to sort of bring it into the conversation on carbon markets. I know it's not easy. Okay, so we have one question on Pigeonhole. I know we reached the cap. I tried to log in myself. So if I can maybe ask my colleagues to flash up if possible. But we have one question that far outranks the votes, like 13 votes, and the rest are all like 2 or 3 votes. And this question is, and I want to actually direct it to Bjorn first before I go to Yi-Chun. So this question is, why has Singapore kept carbon credits, the use of international carbon credits in its compliance mechanism to only 5% of emissions? The question goes on to ask, why not allow more for the growth of carbon markets? So I wanted to get a take from the private sector representative on the panel on this first. Do you see that the cap actually curbs demand? And you talked about quality of demand earlier, right? And then after that, I'll give Yi-Chun a chance to respond to that.
Thank you. So obviously I cannot respond on behalf of the Singapore government, but I think generally what we are seeing in other parts of the world as well is when you introduce a carbon price, whether it's an emissions trading system or a carbon tax within your economy, you're doing it to incentivize your domestic industries to decarbonize. This means you're giving them a price that if you innovate, you pursue green technologies, you will also become more profitable. And of course, as a country, you have a sovereign interest in making sure that the industries within your country follow the rules and decarbonize. The linkage with international carbon markets, whether it's through international carbon credits like Singapore model or other types of offsets, is often used as to reduce the cost of meeting the climate targets, as well as to incentivize and strengthen international collaboration with other partners. So we have seen quite a number of successful examples of linkage with international offsets. But of course, there have also been examples where, let's say, if you allow for 100% of offsets to be used, the price domestically doesn't have as strong effect. And you're also relying on other international partners to deliver the supply of credits to you as compared to simply decarbonizing within your own territory. But I'll give Ji Yun the chance to reply on behalf of Singapore.
Bjorn, you should just join the Singapore government at this point. But no, I think Bjorn laid it out very well. It's really just a balance, I suppose. And 5% is really that balance between how do we generate lead demand for carbon credits of quality, but at the same time still maintain the incentive for our companies to be pursuing decarbonization. And I think it's also, sometimes it's more art than science. You know, at what point do you cap it? And, you know, at some point then will people come back and say, why are you letting your companies use so many carbon credits as well? So it's really about that balance. But yes, Bjorn, you should just join the Singapore government. Yeah.
Okay, so I did want to take one last question because we do have to wrap up for the next panel discussion. I know there was another top voted question which I can't see from my phone, but perhaps we address that one, which is on greenwashing and transparency. I'll read it out for everyone. What are the steps that have been taken to address greenwashing, double counting of credits, and information transparency? I know, so this topic, this panel is on the Article 6, which is the compliance market. But maybe we can actually extend this question to the compliance market, and maybe I'll give each in the first shot at it, because obviously this is the role of the regulatory agency, and he's here as a representative of the Singapore government. Sorry.
It's okay. Sorry, I feel I'm taking up too much time from the rest of the panelists. But really just, I want to zoom in first on double counting actually and transparency, which actually is a major challenge in markets. And actually what Singapore has done is we've worked with the World Bank and the International Emissions Trading Association to headquarter a new company in Singapore called the Climate Action Data Trust. It's a not-for-profit entity. And what CAD Trust does is it operates a blockchain-based metadata layer that links, aggregates, and harmonizes carbon credit data across carbon credit registries. And it applies to both the voluntary carbon market as well as compliance markets. To date, CAD Trust covers 85% of all global carbon credit transactions. And the goal is really to get it to 100%. And all of this information is available on the public data dashboard. So if you go on climateactiondata.org, I think, you will be able to see all the information. And by doing so, I think what we wanted to do is really strengthen transparency in markets. And if you can track the generation, the transfer, the retirement, the cancellation of carbon credits from start to end, that removes actually the risk of double counting. So these are one of the ways that Singapore is trying to work with the ecosystem to provide a public good and really strengthen the infrastructure. But just on greenwashing, I think it's a very relevant concern and something that we see across all sorts of decarbonization and other measures as well in terms of ESG reporting and things like that. Coming back to Bjorn's original point actually, which is about the integrity of demand and supply, actually I think that goes to the heart of how we deal with greenwashing, which is to really make sure that the supply is of high integrity, but also the demand is of good use cases as well. And that's where sovereigns and the ecosystem have to work together to also chart out what is acceptable use, both in compliance and voluntary markets as well.
Yeah, just very briefly, also because I was working for the UNFCCC before, and a lot of our discussion also coming back to adaptation, right, was talking about the locally led adaptation, so LLA, and I think the same could apply to some extent on mitigation. Like, we also have to understand that there are local contexts for mitigation in terms of quality mitigation procedures, making sure that we are responding to the needs of the people on the ground, and that the benefit sharing is also there for local communities. So Yuyun mentioned a number of integrity initiatives. I'll just say some acronyms and then you can Google them. But one of the key ones is the ICVCM, the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets, who introduced the Core Carbon Principles, CCPs, that basically outlines all these additionality, permanence, leakage, safeguards that is important to follow when looking at the supply side. On the demand side, we also have something called the Voluntary Carbon Market Initiative, VCMI, who developed a claims code that basically explains how much credits can a company use to be trustworthy in its decarbonization claims, And of course, IETA, we also develop quite a number of reports, for example, on the urgent need to finance nature and the role of the private sector in doing so. So I'll just also flag that you can check them out on our website, ieta.org. Thank you.
Fantastic. Okay, so any final closing remarks from our panelists? Anyone? Okay, all right, but you'll be staying behind for the networking later if you can. Please join us. So I know we've come to the end of our segment for this panel. I just want to say thank you to everyone. I'm sorry we couldn't get through all the questions, but I personally enjoyed the discussion very much. We'll definitely maybe capture these questions and send them off to our speakers just for their own interest. And yeah, we really appreciate all of the thought-provoking questions, and please reach out to them directly later if you like. So please join me in thanking this wonderful panel for their insights. It was a pleasure. And now it leaves me to hand over the time to Dr. Radhika Bhargava for the next panel discussion on blue carbon. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Melissa. Hi, everyone. My name is Radhika. I'm a research fellow and a National Geographic explorer here at the National University of Singapore. From Prof. Katharine's lecture and the previous panel, we learned that carbon markets are effective in reducing carbon emissions. But there's a big asterisk on top, meaning that these projects and carbon market can only be effective with a lot of conditions applied. So for the upcoming panel discussion on blue carbon project development in the Asia Pacific, I invite you to pause and think, how can we make blue carbon projects specifically high quality and efficient? And to help us do that, we have a great team of panelists. So I invite my panelists to join me on stage. We have Ms. Alison Louise, Director, Climate Partnerships, the Nature Conservancy Asia Pacific. Ms. Lauren Babwick, Director, Capacity and Partnerships, Conservation International. Mr. Saurabh J. Bansal, CEO, GAIT Global, and Assistant Professor Hao Tang, Principal Investigator at the National University of Singapore. Welcome all. So for this panel, all our panelists have created some exciting slides to show. So we'll start with Alison. Your slides will be up and Marcus will help you change. And then we'll go with our self-introductions and some insights from our speakers on blue carbon project development.
Great. Okay, how's that sound? Thank you so much. It's really great to be here. I'll kick off by just sort of sharing briefly. You've heard a lot about TNC, so I'm from the Nature Conservancy, so I won't tell you too much about TNC, but I'll just say a little bit about my perspective. So my title is Director for Climate Partnerships. And I lead a team that works across the Asia-Pacific region to advance high-quality nature-based solutions as an essential part of the Nature Conservancy's response to the combined crises of biodiversity loss and climate change. I'm based in Sydney. I'm visiting in Singapore today, and a number of my team members are based here in Singapore, though I'm sure some of you would have met them before. When we talk about nature-based solutions, or NBS, if I'll start to use the abbreviation, we're really talking about these as a pathway to simultaneously address these interconnected crises of climate change and biodiversity loss. Blue carbon, or the carbon that's captured and stored in coastal and marine ecosystems like mangroves, salt marshes, and seagrass, is a really important part of this. And what we're talking about in this panel, of course, we heard a little bit about this from Katharine as well, specifically, is actions that we can take to conserve, to sustainably manage, or to restore these ecosystems as part of nature-based solutions more broadly. Part of the reason these are so compelling, I mean, I think we've heard a little bit about this today, the different types of benefits, right, that nature-based solutions can deliver, and this is really clear and really strong and compelling for blue carbon specifically, because we know that coastal wetlands are estimated to sequester 7 to 20% of all global CO2 emissions, and we know that these ecosystems can sequester and store carbon dioxide in their underlying soils over longer periods and at levels up to 5 times higher than we see in terrestrial forests. This potential is really high in this part of the world, in the Asia-Pacific region. It's home to half the world's mangroves, a third of global salt marshes, and more than half of the planet's seagrasses. These ecosystems provide habitats for thousands of species. So coming back to that, that interconnection between biodiversity and climate, they reduce vulnerability to negative impacts from climate change, things that we've heard a little bit about, increasingly severe storm surges, flooding, and erosion. And in Asia-Pacific as well, coastal wetlands provide an estimated $3.4 trillion in US dollars worth of US dollars in ecosystem services, and they're relied upon for food and resources and income by millions of people. So I know we've heard a lot about quality, but this is kind of what we're talking about. We're not just interested in any kind of blue carbon projects. We're interested in those high quality projects that can deliver what we call triple benefit outcomes for climate, for nature, and for people. Globally and across the region, TNC works together with an extensive network of partners to build a common understanding of what it means to be high quality triple benefit, and to help project developers and investors understand how to translate what are really high level principles. It's sometimes hard to imagine what that actually looks like on the ground. So we see our role as helping a lot of players to really understand how to translate those principles into actions that they can take. One important example of this is a collaboration with 8 other NGOs called the Southeast Asia Climate and Nature-Based Solutions, or the SEEN Coalition, that's run out of our team here in Singapore. We also have direct experience, the Nature Conservancy, supporting projects across Australia, Aotearoa, New Zealand, Indonesia, China, Papua New Guinea, and the United States, with a particular focus on mangrove ecosystems. So over the last year, through these projects that we've been working on directly, but also through consultations with partners, with other practitioners, with researchers, we've started to distill a number of challenges and lessons learned that we see relating to data, capacity, and investment, and different types of needs to strengthen the enabling environment for the implementation of these high-quality blue carbon projects in the region. And in particular, we see a really important role for policy that maybe isn't always that well understood. And so what we've done is we've captured the challenges and lessons, and we've identified some actions that policymakers can actually take to strengthen to address some of the barriers that we see and strengthen the enabling environment for blue carbon. And that's kind of what I was really excited to have the chance to share a little bit with you today. I think a unique vantage point that we have as an NGO is that we're able to act as a kind of bridge across NBS science, NBS practice, and policy and finance. And so we want to try to play a little bit of that connector role. And we've done this through a paper, and a central objective of that paper was, in fact, to act as this bridge, to really translate lessons and findings in the literature and from practitioner experience into policy measures, that can be implemented to really help accelerate implementation of these projects on the ground. So we convened a number of practitioners. We conducted an extensive literature review and followed that up with a number of consultations. This was done under the leadership of Dr. Daniel King of Wildland Ecological Consultants based out of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and also Yue Wang from TNC, who's here with us. And I'll just, at a high level, say that we identified these 3 main issue areas with equitable participation and governance running as a cross-cutting theme across all 3, ownership and rights, funding and valuing coastal wetlands, and regulatory mandates and priorities. And so for each of these, we went through and kind of identified a number of challenges and then articulated actions that policymakers and governments can take to help address them. And so I've just shared, it's in review now, so probably it will change, but you can have a look at the preprint if you're interested using the QR code behind me, and then obviously happy to share the final paper when it goes through the review process. But thanks.
Thank you so much, Alison, and thanks for sharing the key insights from your paper. Would like to hear more in the follow-up discussion we have. Lauren, now I invite you to introduce yourself.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren. I'm the Director for Capacity Building and Partnerships at the International Blue Carbon Institute, which is based in Conservation International here in Singapore. My background's actually not in blue carbon. It's in climate and nature policy and diplomacy. So I spent the majority of my career with the UK government in London, Fiji, and Singapore, including in the international climate negotiations space. But now I'm leading capacity building for IBCI here in Singapore. And really what my role is focused on is how to strengthen capacity across a number of stakeholders, whether it's policymakers, the finance community, local communities, and academia, to really understand how we can scale blue climate action globally. So maybe just a bit of background about IBCI. So we're a global hub for exchanging expertise and knowledge on blue carbon research and implementation. We're based in Singapore, but our remit is global. So we naturally have a huge focus on Asia Pacific, given what we know about the blue carbon extent here, but we're increasingly engaged in Africa, Latin America as well. And basically, we're focused on how we can support policymakers, local communities, and industry to scale up climate action through blue carbon policy, finance, and science. Why Conservation International? So over the last 15 years, CI has been a leader in the blue carbon space and was a leader in designing and implementing some of the first blue carbon crediting projects, one that I'm hoping most of you have already heard about, Vida Manglar in the Sespada Bay in Colombia. So despite this work, the overarching challenge of how to scale up the work still remains. So there are three major challenges that we see as critical to realize the full potential of blue carbon, which is why IBCI was created. So the first is the lack of high quality methods and tools. So really the ability to implement the science into viable and high integrity blue carbon projects on the ground. The second is a severe shortage of the capacity and skills for practitioners to implement and design blue carbon policies, projects, and to finance them as well. So this is something that's applicable to everyone from international policymakers down to the local community level. And the third is a lack of coordinated action and communication across stakeholders. So years ago, no one was talking about blue carbon. Now everybody's talking about blue carbon. So how do we ensure that we're actually supporting each other's work and not just duplicating it across NGOs, the private sector, as well as governments? So there should be a link, if you go to the next slide, on the screen with some QR codes that just show some of the resources that we have available. But I'd just like to add that we'll be creating a knowledge bank that will basically be a central hub of open source information on everything from what does it mean, what does blue carbon mean in the context of sustainable finance and Article 6, what are mangroves, what is seagrass, what is salt marsh, ecosystems, and how can we action these in a more effective way. What is kelp and why? What are the particular challenges around actually scaling that as a blue carbon ecosystem? So definitely watch this space as we're developing a lot of that work. But then I maybe just want to take just a bit of time and reflect on sort of the trajectory of blue carbon when it comes to the climate and the biodiversity policy space. So in the past, climate action and biodiversity have been quite siloed, and they continue to be siloed to some extent. You have the CPD negotiations that cover biodiversity issues and UNFCCC climate negotiations. A few years ago, I was based in Fiji, and that's really where I first was exposed to the concept of blue carbon. And at the time, it was still a highly controversial concept when you were talking about international climate negotiations and climate policy. This was for very valid scientific reasons and reasons related to MRV. But even at that time, to talk about climate and oceans in the context of the UNFCCC was quite challenging given the complexities of ocean policy. You can see, obviously, these coastal ecosystems as carbon sinks, but you can think about them from a biodiversity perspective as well as from a livelihoods perspective and an economic perspective. So that's complex on its own, but then you add the logistic fact that all of these different sectors sit with different ministries. So it was complex back then. It's still complex now. But I do think there's growing evidence and growing recognition of the need to address climate and biodiversity issues and blue carbon in a more interconnected way. So we heard a bit from the last panel about the IPCC reports. They're indicating various warming scenarios and the need to go beyond technological ways to decarbonize. Nature-based solutions obviously adds a lot to that. There's evidence that MBS can provide up to 30% of the climate mitigation that we need to reach our Paris Agreement goals. And aside from that, there's a lot of powerful co-benefits to blue carbon. So the climate mitigation angle is very important. But as we've heard from other speakers, these ecosystems also provide protection for coastal communities from storm surges and erosion. They support livelihoods like fisheries and tourism. They also create a shelter and food for marine animals and support biodiversity and the health of the ocean as a whole. So I think through all of this, blue carbon has really grown in prominence as one of these climate and biodiversity win-wins. And there's been a lot of remarkable advances in the science and our understanding of how to scale blue carbon ecosystems for both mitigation and adaptation. And this is leading to more rapid development of policy and finance frameworks. But we're not all the way there yet. There's still a lot of challenges that remain. I think there's a common misconception that it's the science and that we don't have all of the scientific answers. That's part of it, but the primary challenges are really around data gaps, especially in some of these regions where we know there's the most potential, but we don't have all of the details. Financing at scale. So we heard about carbon markets in Article 6 in the last session. There's a huge space for blue carbon there, but it's incredibly challenging to attract to finance for scale for blue carbon for a number of different reasons, but one of which is just the land rights and land tenure in terms of who actually owns and has a stake in these ecosystems, as well as governance, community engagement, and land rights. So it's really important that we're ensuring that these projects are sustainable, equitable, and scientifically robust, and this requires ongoing capacity building and engagement from a wide range of stakeholders.
So, thank you, Lauren. As someone who's now navigating research in blue carbon, I highly vouch for these reports from the Blue Carbon Institute. They're extremely helpful. I next invite Saurabh to please introduce yourself and your work.
Sure. Hello. I see lots of familiar faces, but for those of you who have not met before, my name is Saurabh and I'm the CEO of GATE, which is a climate asset management group based here in Singapore. Apologies if I found it sound a little rustic. I just flew up from Tonga, and it's not a very close flight. It's about 10 hours away, so apologies for that. I really wanted to focus today on the other side of Asia Pacific, being the Pacific, which tends to be quite underrepresented and quite under-talked about when it comes to solutions, especially in the blue carbon space. I'm not a scientist. Very much I'm someone who's passionate about climate solutions. That is a product of who I am, and essentially I wanted to share a bit of my background so you understand the context of where I'm coming from. So I was born in New Zealand. I spent a lot of my childhood in both the Pacific, specifically in Tonga as well as India, which is my respective motherlands. Did my bachelor's and undergraduate over in Sydney, moved up to London, and then now I've been based here in Singapore for the last couple of years. So I've kind of done a little bit of a whirlwind around Asia Pacific and then a little dab in the UK and back. I was originally working with an organization called Develop for Good, which during COVID was building technical tools for NGOs and nonprofits. So think things like AI/ML tools, back-end infrastructure, web apps, mobile apps, and those sorts of things. And as you can imagine, during COVID, we ironically became very lucky because every single NGO needed tech help because they were all going virtual and they'd never done it before. And a lot of people were at home with not too much to do and looking for things to do. So I say we got ironically lucky because during COVID, we grew to about 1,200 people, and we worked on about 80 projects. A lot of it being data modeling for climate solutions and climate disasters, and that's what really introduced me to the world of climate, which is when then I popped over and began GATE. Alongside GATE, I'm also a climate and international policy advisor for the government of Tonga, and so on their behalf, as well as Pacific, Small Island, Developing States, everything to do with loss and damage, Article 6, and anything and everything in between, I advocate for them to get more financing and more attention. So to the next slide. So because probably out of all the organizations and panels you guys have heard from today, I'm probably the one you're least likely to have heard about. I thought it'd probably be worthwhile to share a bit about us. So based here in Singapore, we are a nature-based solution-focused climate asset management group. Very much, a vision and mission revolves around trying to unlock the full scale and impact of nature-based solutions. And so within that, essentially, from a desktop point of view, we look after the full end-to-end when it comes to NBS. So everything from originating financing to feasibility assessments to spatial mapping to project designs, carbon markets, project registration, as well as carbon market trading. We do that from an end-to-end perspective, from a desktop perspective. But a lot of what we do tends to focus on in developing countries, and a lot of that is in the Pacific, where carbon markets are only very recently starting to become unlocked. And so an example of that is, and one of our pieces of work that we're currently working on is we're currently finalizing a national feasibility assessment for climate solutions in Tonga. So that's alongside the government of Tonga. And the reason why I was just in Tonga was Tonga just hosted the Pacific Islands Forum, which, for those who do not know, is essentially like the equivalent of ASEAN Secretariat or the Commonwealth, where they talk about solutions, they talk about problems, they talk about barriers, and essentially how they can work together to overcome those. Interestingly enough, it was the first time a United Nations Secretary General ever visited and actually came to that forum. And so off the back of that and off the back of His Excellency Antonio Guterres attending, Tonga launched the Pacific Resilience Facility, which is to tap into the very recently unlocked loss and damage financing, which is very much needed in the region. But essentially, to even know where to begin and what to do, of course, you have to be able to measure, have a baseline, and know what will be the most effective solutions. And so what we've been doing for the last 2 years is a myriad of on-ground samplings as well as spatial mappings to ascertain what actually does the landscape within Tonga and its 700,000 kilometers squared ocean space look like, which has been a very difficult thing, to be candid, because historically speaking, the Pacific in general has had a huge lack of research institutions, a huge lack of research efforts, a huge lack of private sector participation. And so within that, the actual amount of work that's needed to build repositories of data, capacity building, education, and so forth locally has been a huge challenge, but something that we're slowly working towards. And so just within the Pacific, and where I'll finish up on is, for those who do not know, the Pacific represents about 20% of the world's EEZ, so about 20% of the world's economic zones. But within that, they only contribute between 0.03 to 0.05% of global emissions. And so when people talk about underrepresentation and those who contribute the least but get affected the most, the Pacific is very much on top of that list of people who apply to that. And so even within Tonga, 2 years ago, there was the Hunga Hapai Tonga volcanic eruption, which was the loudest and biggest volcanic eruption in modern recorded history. And that caused a tsunami that wiped out essentially every single mangrove population with Tonga as an example. And since then, the amount of resilience and adaptation that has occurred has been very limited because essentially there's no financing to do so. And so facilities like the Pacific Resilience Facility is something that we hope will make a change to that. But essentially within that, we're really trying to bring more private sector and intergovernmental participation to the country to try and increase that education and awareness within the region. But I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Saurav. Thanks for taking us to Tonga through your introduction. Now I invite Hao to take us to the world of remote sensing.
Sure. I think I have some. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the technology side. So today I think we heard a lot of pain points in the current carbon market or the developments for, saying, support for conservation. High quality MRV and geospatial are going to come over and over again, in particular if we want to scale up the conservation efforts on nature-based climate solution, right? I'm sure in this room, or at least my hope, is that half of the people might have heard the terminology remote sensing or satellite. Correct me if I'm wrong here. But just as an introduction, this is what has been the development of satellite imageries or geospatial technology have been playing a key role in conservation and climate-related research, at least in the past few decades. And this is what you typically see that. Well, again, an example of Singapore, right? With a nice stack of imagery showing the changes of the coastline and alike. And we can also see some of the specific details here. For example, this is in Pulau Ubin and actually shows some of the efficacy of restoration projects there. This is why I'm a little surprised to see, we actually haven't done enough in the climate tracker with Singapore's activity. Actually, there are a lot of things ongoing there. But as technology improves, we get greater transparency and somehow the precision that's really required to make decisions. This is one of the examples of the area photography where you really be able to count down individual trees. This is super high resolution at 7 centimeters. Now you're starting able to count individual trees. Let's somehow not necessarily remove or completely address the transparency issue, but at least reduce to some degree. And things can be even further down. If you look at, one of the particular transect there, you might be able to see some of the trees or mangroves are coming back. So speaking of data now, it's not about just, we have some mangroves here. We're starting doing some real measurements, which is directly related to one thing. the quantity measurement or the amount of the 1 ton of carbon, where they are, and do we see any change of that? So if you take the difference of the two measurements done in 2014 and 2019, 5 year difference, you will see the efficacy of the real changes of carbon. Where you can see, well, in the pink side, you see a lot of growth or gain in carbon, while in the green is where your baseline is. This is so far the best tool we can have in the current technology to provide or improve the current efficiency of carbon economy, which hasn't really been available a decade ago. And I believe with the development of technology, the technology by itself will be a less concern. But one problem with this is that the cost of scaling this up. So this can cost quite some money. For example, this is one of the development. Can you play the video there? Okay, there we go. So this is not some kind of the ChatGPT generated animation or like, these are the actual measurements which my team took in Pulau Ubin, where you just saw the size there. This provides a three-dimensional detailed quantification, not any kind of estimate or any of the ad hoc numbers. These are things subject to independent verification. Whoever can come here and do another measurement pretty much can come up with the same answer. This really matters to address the transparency issue, at least in my mind. But of course, there are a lot of things to be addressed as we highlight that local communities participation, land tenure system, etc., etc. But at least it's my hope that the technology advancement can bring some hope, or at least address clear some of the barriers for the implementation of the carbon market. Or like, one problem with the technology development is, well, this is Singapore, and somehow we are relatively well-funded and being able to do a lot of things. What about the countries that do not have that technology development? How about remote countries, saying in the center of Africa, in the center of Amazon, also some of the Pacific Islands? What do we do with that? This is some of the work that I've been working with NASA. So we basically come up with not just on the ground, but put it on the satellites. So this is the International Space Station. We apply pretty much the same technology and put it on a space station, shooting the lasers down, that be able to have a detailed three-dimensional measurement of the Earth's structure. By doing that, we provide or improve additional quantification capability of the ecosystem services that has never been measured to such detail before. This is really, or at least it is just a beginning of a 3D measurement as we speak. It is my hope that in the next decade or so, we'll be able to do this not only not necessarily at a small scale, but expand it to the global, such that we be able to improve the overall land management, land and coastal regions through this additional information. That's all from me.
Thanks, Hao. Thanks. Those videos were cool, right? It was so awesome to see mangroves in 3D on our screens right here. So as we move to the second part of our panel, I'll ask my team to put up the Pigeonhole QR code on the screen. I invite all of you to send in your questions. But if I heard that some people are not able to log in or there's a capacity blockade, so we can go old school, you can raise your hands and we'll still take questions that way. I also wanted to highlight that we have 4 people here from very varied fields, from science to remote sensing to those who have worked with the governments, at capacity building, at international scales with international organizations. So this is really the right time to get your most pressing blue carbon question answered. So while the room is warming up to questions, I'll start with Ellison and ask her, in the paper that you guys recently sent for review, could you please elaborate on the key challenges and proposed policy solutions identified in the paper? Specifically, based on your research, what are some actions that policymakers can take to improve how enabling environments can be created for blue carbon in the Asia Pacific?
Sure. So I think what I'll do is maybe I'll just kind of give one example of one of the themes that we looked at. And I think Lauren mentioned this as well. So ownership and rights, right, is kind of one of the general basket of challenges that we looked at. And we had this cross-cutting focus on equity and participation and governance as well that ran through it, right? So I can kind of, I guess we kind of organized around 3 main challenges that we saw under that ownership and rights heading, right? And then identified some policy solutions to that. So the first one, and this one is is probably true for lots of nature-based solutions, but seems to be particularly difficult in coastal ecosystems, which is just that it's very difficult to clarify ownership and land use rights, right, in many of the project sites that we're looking at. And that's often, of course, the basis for primary carbon rights, right, if we're talking about the potential for carbon trading and the benefits that flow from that. So this can be due to limited data in some cases, but even when there is pretty decent data on ownership, it's often limited to statutory ownership rights. And so, how the land's actually being used, or if there are any customary claims to that land, is often, not available, right? So I think that's one really important challenge, especially when we're talking about high integrity projects, right, which we are today. Gender is a really kind of, I think doesn't probably get the attention that it needs in the discussions around quality and integrity. So again, women are in a lot of the places that we are working in Asia Pacific, women are kind of disproportionately dependent on coastal ecosystems as compared to men, yet in spite of that dependence, they're often quite underrepresented in the scoping and development of blue carbon projects. And, there's an element of sort of just inequity there, but there are also very real gender risks that we see. You're giving a monetary value to something that didn't have a monetary value before, right? And so that can kind of unleash a lot of different interests and risks for women we've seen in many cases. So that's another really important challenge. And then this one is an interesting one that is really specific to coastal areas, where in a lot of places, and it looks a little bit different in different places, but we've seen this pop up in a few of the different countries we looked at, that once land is re-flooded or re-inundated with water, land that might have been privately held before, there is often a legal basis for the government to reclaim that area, right? So there's a risk there. If you own land, it's a real strong disincentive for you to seriously consider developing a carbon project if it may weaken your land rights, right? So those are kind of three big challenges that we identified, and I think the policy ideas that flow from that are, first of all, it's one thing. There are lots of we see in the voluntary market different types of standards and principles and requirements, but there is a pretty strong case to actually regulate, like we heard the government of Singapore talk about safeguards that they've introduced. Like, there's a pretty strong case to actually regulate certain standards and requirements around, in particular, participatory, gender equitable, GPS-based mapping of an area before a project's developed, and having that information transparently available. And that should account for both statutory and customary land claims. This should include, as much as possible, working with customary and local institutions where that's relevant. So those are institutions that often already exist and get often neglected. And so again, having regulations that kind of outline these requirements for project developers so that it's not left to voluntary action. And I think, governments can also do this at a jurisdictional level as well. If they, that's another approach to take, is to undertake this mapping at a jurisdictional level and to have that data and those files be available, right, for project developers, right, to apply even at the project level. We also feel really strongly that gender analyses should be part of any project that's developed as well. So that's really the only way that you can kind of understand the gendered risks, right, but also the opportunities to have positive gender impact as well. So again, that's something that can be, regulated and required. I think specifically the issue around the inundation is that's really clear, is kind of if there's a decision that blue carbon opportunities are a priority, there may be a need to go back and review those laws and actually introduce some amendments or clarifications, right, to kind of remove that disincentive. And so I think, there's opportunity for governments to obviously lead that process, in fact, necessary. And then I think both of these two types of policy measures that I mentioned can really be underpinned by broader awareness-raising efforts around just what blue carbon is, or what the value of coastal ecosystems are, what role can blue carbon play in protecting or delivering the outcomes that people want from these ecosystems. And so some kind of general awareness raising for local government authorities, but also involving Indigenous peoples and local communities in the area. And that really lays an important foundation for an FPIC process, right? That's kind of the beginning of the kind of informed piece of the FPIC process. So I think that's, again, we see governments doing that for all kinds of issues, public health issues, and so I think there's a really strong role to do that as well for governments that want blue carbon to be part of one mechanism that they're using to really maximize these outcomes from their coastal ecosystems. So that's one example.
Thank you so much, Alison. That was really in-depth. So accountability, inclusion, and transparency are key. I'm getting very excited by looking at the Pigeonhole Q&A. You guys are going to be popular during the reception. So I'm going to combine a few questions and ask both Saurav and Lauren to add on the capacity building aspect on designing these blue carbon projects as one thing. And the second part is, maybe you can start with the second part, like by giving an example of what a high quality or a good or effective blue carbon project looks like on the ground. Somebody also asked about the business model. So if you can add and elaborate a bit on that, but also what kind of capacity building is needed to support these kinds of good quality projects.
Thanks. I might just start with a bit of an example of what we found has been a really good model for building capacity, at least at the government space. So last year, CI hosted a blue carbon capacity building workshop for ASEAN and AOSIS policymakers here in Southeast Asia. So we had representation from, I think, basically every ASEAN government and a few select Pacific Island governments as well. And that was really, really foundational level. So really the basics of what is blue carbon policy, how do you start to develop a blue carbon policy framework, how do you finance this, what are sort of the outlying questions that you need to consider about the science and technology aspects. That was really great. I mean, you can only really build capacity to a certain level when you're trying to target that many governments. Obviously, you can't compare the government of Indonesia's perspective and experience and needs on something like blue carbon with that of Tonga. So that was useful, but it was sort of really just the starting point. But what emerged out of that was CI was approached by 4 different countries following that to say that we're really interested, we really have political will to develop blue carbon policy in country, and we want help to do that, which I think is the most important takeaway from my perspective on capacity building is that we're being asked by the governments to come in and support scale that up, which means from the get-go we know that there's policy buy-in to actually deliver and implement whatever recommendations we give. So one of the countries that came forward to us was Cambodia. So we went in and did a bespoke and targeted capacity building workshop, this time not just with policymakers, but with the local communities, with the private sector and with other NGOs, which I think is an important point to make as well, because I think oftentimes we can work in silos in some of these things, and we're often hosting the similar types of workshops, but really we need to come together and be involved in each other's pieces of work. So that was a really valuable example of sort of how we had demand-driven and political will-guided capacity building. The next phases of that is we're still supporting Cambodia in developing a national blue carbon roadmap. We're doing more technical work with other partners like USAID to help underpin and inform some of the more technical and data gaps to actually deliver that. But I think that's a really good example of how you can ensure that you're building capacity in a way that's top down, in the sense that you have political will and you know that the outcomes will be implemented, but also ensuring that you're bringing in all the relevant stakeholders, including the local communities, into that process. There was many other parts of that question, but I'll pause there and let Saurav come in.
Sure. There's probably 3 main areas that are very big barriers when it comes to developing blue carbon, at least in developing country regions. First is awareness and education. Second is finance and capacity. Third is a little interesting one, but it's probably around like legalities, policies, and foreign affairs pressures, if that makes sense. To the first point on education and awareness, I would say there's still a very big misconception that blue carbon can only be achieved through philanthropic efforts. And so when you look at somewhere like a Pacific nation who have many other things to worry about before they worry about generating carbon credits as a revenue stream, they're not even thinking, is developing a mangrove restoration project something that's feasible if there's no financing available to do so, right? But if you're able to design a project that generates a revenue stream from carbon credits, whether through Article 6 or otherwise, then suddenly that becomes something that, they're interested to do so because it becomes a priority for them. The financing and the capacity side is a mixture of lack of private sector involvement in the Pacific and lack of non-multilateral financing that has entered the region historically. When you you look at the big likes of big oil and gas, big financial institutions that tend to be the big buyers of carbon credits as an example, they've never ever done transactions in the South Pacific as an example before, right? And so to get them to participate in an industry that is already quite volatile and non-traditional in a region that they've never deployed finance in before is a massive barrier. And then 3, when I talk about policies, legalities, and foreign affairs, disputes or pressure, I'm talking about when you're talking massive ocean areas that have, all the tuna stocks in the region, potential for seabed mining, resources, and those sorts of things. There tend to be pressures from larger and higher foreign powers who offer, this amount of money to, do seabed mining and fishing versus this amount of money if you do conservation efforts in a commercial way. And so that kind of historical pressure has been a huge barrier also to overcome. And so when I look at traditional carbon projects such as a mangrove, well, I say traditional, but I'd say more vanilla carbon projects such as a mangrove restoration or an afforestation project, somewhere like islands in the Pacific is a bit difficult to do so, because if I take Tonga as an example, where the entire land area is the same size of Singapore, which is already considered a very small country, that same land area is spread across 170 islands. And so when you think of how much actual on-land terrestrial space there is, as well as coastline space, it's very limited. And so it's very hard to get a project at scale, And so when you're trying to do 170 plus mangrove restoration projects across all the coastlines of Tonga as an archipelago, it becomes a very unfeasible project. And so probably what we're more looking at and looking to develop within the region is less conventional conservation efforts. Whether you're looking at things like things that are aligned with 30 by 30 vision, so protecting 30% of the ocean by 2030. Can we do that through a biodiversity bond? Or can we do things, like a sovereign-funded blue bond, or those sorts of examples that are a little less conventional than traditional carbon projects? But again, getting uptake to that is, both internally from the government, but also elsewhere from financiers to enter, is something that we're working on and something that I'd love someone to help me crack the formula on.
Can I just add on really quick, because you made a really important point about scale, and I think when we talk about financing blue carbon, we talk about the carbon markets. That's an issue we often face. We have a lot of people come to IBCI and say, we have a batch of mangroves and we want a blue carbon project, and we want to generate carbon credits off this project. And unfortunately, it's not that simple. So there's a lot of work going on to address that. But I just want to make the point of the importance of, in tandem with looking at carbon credits, also considering non-market methods of financing, blended finance, philanthropic finance. There's a lot of other methods we should be looking at to help scale these basically action to protect these ecosystems.
Yeah, thanks for adding that, because there were a few questions on where's the money coming from. So moving towards, I'm aware of the time, but how there are a lot of questions for you. So I'll just pick the top couple of questions. Talking about money, people want to know how costly this technology that you showed is, what are different options to financing is, or who's funding it, and also what's the level of accuracy? Is ground truthing needed? How can we do it? So if you can add a bit more on that.
I feel like this will probably come up from some, potential investor or project developers. Unfortunately, the answer to this question might go quite along, because there's no single answer or single dollar per carbon wise. Let's just put it this way, right? But I do agree with the previous, all the rest of the panelists here, is that I think the requirement for high quality data is definitely on the rise. And acquire it at a cheaper way is going to happen, and it will happen. So having said that, I don't think the technology by itself is really the bottleneck. It might be at this moment, but just as I showed how the progress of remote sensing in the past 20 years, it shouldn't be, or it's less likely to be a main problem or concern in the future. What I do worry or do want to highlight, or maybe worth for or discussion, is that we might want to think about the consistency of the project development. What I mean by that is, as technology develops, and as science too, what do we think were the best science 20 years ago might not be the best science anymore at the moment. How we be able to keep the consistency across time in technology and in science, and align with our best interest of goal of conservation, is something worth taking. It's not about the cost by itself. Of course, it matters for project, but in terms of our goal, that shouldn't be the focus.
Thanks, Hao. As we come close to the time, I would like to invite our panelists if there are any final thoughts or comments.
I just picking up on kind of what the discussion now. One thing that really strikes me is a lot of times you get into conversations and we talk about like, oh, we need to do more research, or we need more capacity development, or we need better policies, like as if, and then there are projects, like as if these are all different things, like to spend money on. But if you just do some like by doing projects is the only way that we're going to figure all this stuff out. So actually applying the tech on the ground in a real world project, like and building capacity around that project. So I think this pilot projects are one of the best vehicles to actually to get the science right, to get the capacity development going, to understand the financial models right. And I just think that's kind of where our focus needs to be. So where there is grant and philanthropic funding available to tackle those other objectives, like let's put it into more pilot projects so we can really kind of understand what it actually looks like when it hits the ground, because it's often very different from project to project. And so I think, that's sort of something that's been striking me, like, let's just do some projects and we can sort of tick all those boxes, and we need to really document and transparently share what we're learning from those projects. And when they're private, like there's a whole risk around greenwashing and people are nervous about reputational risk, but if we agree these are kind of for research purposes, like maybe we can kind of pool resources together and sort of do that, figure the things out through implementation.
Thanks, Alison. So learning by doing. This was a very exciting panel for me. We learned a lot about the challenge. Like we have come a long way for Blue Carbon Project, but there's a lot of steps to cover. We learned about key challenges, but also some practical examples of how challenges like data or capacity or inclusion can be improved in the Blue Carbon projects. There were a lot of questions that did not go answered, but our panelists are going to hang around for the reception that's going to start soon. So I invite all the audience members to stay back and get your conversation going with the panelists of this and the previous session as well. Thank you so much, panelists, for a very engaging conversation, and thank you all.
Wow, okay. I hope all of you have a very good time with the panel discussions as I had. So I hope that all of you would have broadened perspective on how we can work towards a climate resilient future. So can we just put our hands together again to thank the panelists and the moderators? Yes, and before we close this event, I'd just like to invite Ms. Alison Lewin from TNC to give some closing remarks.
Hello again. I'll keep it brief. I'll just start by really echoing Cheryl's thanks to all of our speakers, to our moderators, to all of you for making the time, to spend a couple of hours with us this afternoon, and a big thanks to the whole team behind this event as well. I think, and I hope it's fair to say that, one thing that maybe unites all of us here today is kind of a real sincere commitment to realize the potential role that nature can play in helping us tackle this climate crisis that we're in. I think we've heard nature-based solutions, when they're extended across all of forests, wetlands, and croplands, and coastal wetlands, ocean areas, have the ability to mitigate about 11 gigatons of greenhouse gases annually, or about a third of what we need to get to 2030. We know that all scenarios for meeting, whether it's a 1.5 or a 2 degrees target, absolutely require nature-based solutions. We know that countries can't meet their climate targets without nature-based solutions. And these targets, they don't only need to be met, but they actually, we need to see more ambition, we need to exceed them. But we also know that nature-based solutions are absolutely not a substitute, right, to other forms to the kind of decarbonization that's needed that we heard Katharine also talk about earlier this afternoon. But it's not a question of doing one or the other. We need to do everything, and we need to do it really, really quickly. Again, we know that carbon markets and carbon trading are not the only tool available to help us get there, but they're a really, really important one. They're one that have the potential to be a very high impact strategy if done well, if done with integrity on both the supply and the demand side, like we've heard about today. And we hope that we can sort of help bring this to life with events like what we have today here, like the event that we've hosted today together with NUS and with the Center for Nature-Based Climate Change. And so we think that creating a space to bring together different perspectives, to bring together different actors and different sets of expertise that can all play their part, right, in helping to realize this potential is something really important. We think that being a bridge between kind of research and practitioner learning and policy decisions and investment decisions that get made is a really important role that we want to continue to play and to work with all of you to keep doing more of. And so I think, you know, our main hope is that when you leave here today, after everything that you've heard, you'll be walking away with something, some better understanding, some new idea, some term to Google that can sort of help you think about what role you can play in this journey that we're all on together. So I think I'll end there with a big thanks and just encouraging everyone to join us for a brief reception that we're having after this, and hope to get the chance to say hi to some of you now. So thanks very much, everyone.
I just had some housekeeping announcements, and first of all, thank you, Alison, and thank you everyone for being here today. As we look to close today's event, we also want to once again extend our gratitude to the speakers, moderators, panelists, and everyone from TNC as well as the Center for Nature-Based Climate Solution for putting today's event together. And finally, a big thank you to everyone here for attending. Hey, before we end, we would appreciate if you could scan this QR code and give us feedback on today's event. And we have also catered some refreshments for the networking reception. It is located right outside the LT. So please head towards the lift lobby and our friendly ushers will guide you to the reception area. Okay, so yeah, that's the feedback form. And once you guys are done, or whenever you're feeling, you just head off to the reception. Thank you.
Yeah.